Good morning. Today is Wednesday, September 12th, 2018. It is 9:01 a.m. I'm Councilmember Lorena Gonzalez. I am the chair of this committee, which is the Gender Equity, Safe Communities, New Americans, and Education Committee. Joining me at the table is my colleague, Councilmember Rob Johnson. Good morning. So we have a very full agenda today, so we're going to go ahead and dig in. As usual, we're going to begin today's meeting with public comment. Each speaker who signed up on the speaker sheet is allotted up to 2 minutes to provide the City Council Committee their public testimony on a subject that is on the agenda or that is part of the committee's work plan. And so we'll go ahead and begin with public testimony. We have one person signed up to give us public testimony, and that is Alex Zimmerman.
No, it's not green. Oh, right now, yeah. Okay. You still 7 seconds for me. It's okay. Hi, my name is Alex Zimmerman, and I want to speak about agenda number 5, Seattle Police Department overtime overexpenditure. And I think us policemen are acting like a racketeering. You know what it means? We spend 1,000 and 1,000 hours for police, pay them a ton of money, and they don't doing job what is supposed to be protect and serve. It's exactly what has happened right now. So I give you classic example. It's staying next federal line and charge people for using HIV line. So for 2 months, I try to understand how much this costs city. So what has happened? It's very simple. I pay 3 tickets, $250 is total $750 for 2 months. So I go and make a public request. What is I find? This motorcycle, yes, for 2 years, from 15 to 17, jumped by 40%, from 13,000 to 17,000 ticket. Why is this people doing? Staying in federal line and make us pay dues? A racketeering, a cow who give money? It's exactly what's happened. This is exactly what has happened right now. So we're talking about 1,000 and 1,000 hour overpayment. It's number one. And number two, I cannot go to public commissioner, Seattle Police Commissioner, and speak. It's very unique situation, like never happened before. So, Sieg Heil, my Dory Brown Führer, a Nazi psychopath, a crook, anti-Semite, and killer. That's exactly what has happened right now. You need to stop in this. What are you doing in this chamber? Thank you very much.
That's the last person that we had signed up for public comment. Is there anyone else who is with us today who didn't have an opportunity to sign up for public comment but wishes to provide us with comment?
Yes.
Okay, please come on up. We're just going to ask that you sign your name in after you're done, but if you can start by saying your name and then letting us know what agenda item you're here to speak to, that'd be great.
All right. Hi, my name is Mark. I'd like to speak to agenda item number 5. I wanted to know if there's a wider investigation into the Seattle city departments for budget overtures.
Just in general?
Yeah, just in general.
We're happy to talk to you about that afterwards, but if there's anything else you want to say, now is your opportunity.
I think that's it.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
We generally don't have a back and forth during public comment, but just really quickly, there is oftentimes a process through our supplemental budgeting process that allows City Council and the mayor an opportunity to reevaluate budget appropriations and allocations to the various city departments, including the Seattle Police Department. The Seattle Police Department overtime report that we'll be hearing on our agenda today is, in fact, a result of the City Auditor's Office doing a full audit of the Seattle Police Department's overtime expenditures, which is why this committee has been spending much time on the issues related to overtime, is because of the results of that audit. But our departments are oftentimes audited both by the state, by the federal government, and by our own city auditor's office in order to ensure good fiscal policy and governance. And I don't know if Councilmember Johnson, you have anything else to add? Great. Okay. We will go ahead and close out the public comment period, seeing no one else wanting to speak and provide us with testimony. And we'll go ahead and dig into our first agenda item. If you're here to present on the first agenda item, I'll invite you to join us at the table while Cody reads this item into the record.
Agenda Item 1, Resolution 31816, a resolution related to the City of Seattle's Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan for briefing, discussion, and possible vote.
Thank you, Cody. We'll go ahead and start with introductions, and then I will hand it over to you, Lisa. I think you're going to kick us off.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Great.
I'm Lisa Kay, Council Staff.
Barb Graff, the Director of the Office of Emergency Management.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The resolution before you today, which is number 31816, would update the city's comprehensive emergency management plan by adopting the following new and/or revised documents: a new CEMP introduction, a revised emergency operations plan, revised continuity of government plan, and updated emergency support function number 14, which is transition to recovery. And Barb Graff, as you heard, is here as Director of Office of Emergency Management to brief you on this.
Great. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for making time for this. This is like your regular tire change and lube job for emergency plans. There's not a lot new to these plans. There's just a restructuring. The city's emergency management program went through accreditation 2 years ago, and as a result found that we could organize our plans in a slightly different structure that makes it easier for professionals who come in to assess our program to find the documentation that they need. So the Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan itself is like the umbrella of all the planning that we do. Beneath it, you'll find a mitigation plan, an emergency operations plan, emergency support functions, which are functional chapters to that plan, long-term disaster recovery framework, et cetera. But it's meant to set the doctrine and the program for the city's emergency management plan in place. We had grown into a habit over a period of years with different people updating our plans that we just kept adding things to what we called the CEMP base plan. And as a result, it kind of bloated up to about 361 pages, made it challenging to train people on it, et cetera. So you'll see that the new documentation, much leaner, much more to the point, so that the Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan introduction just sets the program. How do you find emergency management within the city of Seattle? Who's responsible for what, et cetera? The emergency operations plan that follows that is literally in the response phase. What happens with incident command in the field, what happens with strategic coordination within the Emergency Operations Center, et cetera. We did add more of a definition to what we meant by lead agency in this year's revision to the Emergency Operations Plan. We used to have a chart that just said who is the lead agency in case of fire or earthquake or transportation incident, et cetera. And we added a section that better spelled that out. Again, because we want to use these plans as training documents for the citywide organization and for the community. The continuity of government plan used to be an element of the old CEMP base plan, and we pulled that out again so it's easier to train people on the various parts of our charter, our code, and our ordinances that establish lines of succession and how we essentially recover all of our most critical operations in the city. And then the emergency support function 14 that Lisa referenced used to be the only way that we talked about recovery until the council was kind enough to fund a full-fledged exemplary disaster recovery framework that we now have in place. And it goes into a much greater depth and envisions an actual catastrophic event when we're having to deal with things like what the southern states dealt with in the hurricanes last year, with what Hawaii and frankly the East Coast is dealing with this week, with wildfire situations, and in our case, our worst earthquake. Because we have that big full-fledged recovery framework in place, ESF 14, transition to recovery, is just meant to be something that gets us through the smaller events and takes us through a full recovery, or is a bridge to a much broader, long-lasting recovery effort. The bodies within the city who approve these plans before we bring them to you are a citywide emergency management disaster management committee that has representatives of pretty much all city departments. Christy Villa from the legislative department serves on that group. They review the plans, they help us update them, and they approve them, and then we take them to the mayor's emergency executive board, which for all intents and purposes is almost all cabinet members and senior level members of the mayor's staff. And then the mayor promulgates and suggests to council approval of the update of our plans. Again, these are just regular updates that we're providing. The changes are more structural in nature than content, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Barb. One of the things that occurs to me is that what sadly appears to be our new normal is air quality and diminished poor air quality as a result of many of the wildfires that occur in our area. You're familiar with, I'm sure, the fact that the news outlets were reporting that we actually had some of the worst air quality, actually the worst air quality in the world a couple times during the last month or so, and it certainly appears to be a new normal, unfortunately. And this is the first summer that I've seen people actually wearing industrial sort of grade masks in order to just be able to breathe. Does this plan cover air quality? And if so, can you talk a little bit more about what it says?
Thanks for the question. Sometimes it's fun to be compared to China. That was not a week we wanted to be compared to China. What this plan, what the Emergency Operations Plan does do on page 2-3 is it identifies lead agency, and we didn't include air quality, but that would fall under disease, even though poor air quality is not a disease necessarily. But it does show that the lead agency is Public Health Seattle-King County. So we did what our plan says, and that is we pivoted off of everything they advised us to do. They were in close coordination with the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, and so everything they had to say about what does it mean to go from moderately unhealthy to unhealthy for healthy individuals and all that type of thing, we were amplifying all their public messaging. We were trying to help explain the difference between an ordinary hardware dust mask and a properly fitted N95 or N100 mask that would provide better protection for people with certain kinds of health conditions. So it does identify who the lead agency is in the documents before you today. In another document that will come back for approval next year, the Seattle Hazard Identification and Vulnerability Analysis, that goes into much greater detail describing the conditions, the consequences, and the types of strategies that we use.
I'll be looking forward to receiving that information. I do think that, I think there is interest amongst our colleagues here to sort of really dig into what the city's specific role is when air quality is so poor. And I appreciate the connection and the coordination with the Seattle-King County Public Health organization, and we provide them with funding for enhanced services, and I just would like to get a better sense of how those enhanced services dollars are being utilized for this particular space in those summer months in which air quality is really just unbearable. And so, I think, unfortunately, this is going to be a reoccurrence, I think, for us here in the summers, and I think it'll be really important for us to think about how we take care of our most vulnerable populations, both through our emergency management plans and the vulnerability assessment that you're describing, and of course, in partnership and conjunction with the region, because it's a regional issue.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right. That is it. So we are going to move to adopt.
Do we have to adopt this resolution?
Yeah. I was getting there. But thank you. I'm going to move for the adoption of Resolution 31816 to recommend its adoption by the full City Council.
Second.
Okay. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay. Resolution passes. It will advance to full council this Monday.
Thank you for your
Thank you
support
so
and the
much.
support of your staff. We appreciate it.
Thanks. All right, so we are going to move on to our second agenda item, which is just a briefing and discussion. So if you're here to present on the Georgetown Public Safety Task Force report, I invite you to join us at the table while Cody reads this agenda item into the record.
Agenda item 2, briefing on the Georgetown Public Safety Task Force report for briefing and discussion.
Thank you, Cody. All right, while folks settle in, we will go ahead and begin with introductions.
Greg Doss, Council Central. Greg Doss, Council Central staff.
Tom Van Bronckhorst, Department of Neighborhoods.
Sam Ferrazzano with Equinox Studios in Georgetown.
Joanne Tilley, resident of Georgetown.
Bergquist, I live in Georgetown also.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, and to the task force members and to Department of Neighborhoods. Thank you so much for the work that you did to get to this point. I know it was a little bit of a whiplash speed, but usually when we put together these public safety task force, the prior two task force that we did, one in Chinatown International District, the other one in South Park, and Georgetown is the third iteration of that particular model. Our hope is that this is phase one part of the work, and that this will provide the city council and the mayor an opportunity to really continue to develop a relationship and have a work plan around the issues that are flagged. So this is not a one bite at the apple and it's over. It's really is envisioned as an opportunity to continue to engage on some of these critical public safety issues and vitality issues that that are quite complex and certainly cannot be fixed overnight as much as we wish we could do that. So I appreciate your service on the task force, and I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to share some information with us, but I think Greg is gonna get us going, and then...
Thank you, Madam Chair. Your introduction was pretty thorough. The only thing that I would add is that the goals that were officially developed for the task force is to identify new neighborhood policing strategies that build on the department's micro-community policing plans, and also to identify a strategy for culturally and linguistically responsive, data-driven approaches to improve the city's relations to effectiveness with the Georgetown neighborhood. And so with that, I would just turn it over to our guest today.
Great. I just wanted to provide some additional context for the council members that I want to thank the council for the contribution, the $10,000 that they provided, and this was combined with $6,000 from the Department of Neighbors that allowed us to bring on Broadview Planning, which helped through this process and prepared the final report. It was truly an organic effort on behalf of the community. The Georgetown Community Council came together actually before the task force was seated in January and February to hold two community crime forums in response to perceived and real uptick in property crime in that community. And that was widely attended and was a good process that resulted in the community thinking about things that they wanted the city to do to help in this, but also thinking about what the community wanted to do to help in this process. And that was, I want to thank the South Precinct, Captain Grossman, Lieutenant Upton, Lieutenant Gallegos, because they were actively involved in those crime forums. That led to the, about that time that was wrapping up was when we were ramping up the task force. There were 4 meetings, 14 members representing the community. Very fast process, as you mentioned, and resulting in the report that we have before you today. And I'm going to let submitted in August, early August. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to the task force members to talk about the recommendations.
Great.
So I lived in Georgetown for almost 11 years. I love the neighborhood. It's a great neighborhood. It's always been a scrappy neighborhood with a lot of unique challenges. But the last 2 years have been strikingly different. So, myself, I've been faced with a number of thefts and trespasses. I mean, on a weekly basis, almost every neighbor that I've talked to has similar stories. People in close proximity to me just recently have had woken up to have people find out people are broken their houses. Just a couple months ago, I had a police officer stop by my house looking for security footage because there was a rape that happened a couple hundred feet from my house. So and this isn't just anecdotal. If you look at the SPD dashboard, there's been about a 47% increase in crime in our neighborhood in the last 2 years. So I definitely want to thank the police, Captain Grossman, Officer Gallegos, Officer Howard have all shown up to community meetings. They've answered some tough questions from the community members. And so I really want to thank them. And I really want to thank the council for sponsoring the task force. But we definitely have an ask that we're going to be looking for. And Joanne and Sam are going to be diving more in the details of that. But really it's to partner and drive this deeper, as Councilmember Gonzalez has mentioned. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So yeah, this stress on a lot of work to do and not having a lot of time to do it. we have a very vibrant and enthusiastic community that are really interested in coming together to partner with the city to leverage the resources that we can get and that we have as a community and the resources we can get from the city to really further this work and take it to the level that it needs to go to. We need to be more inclusive and need capacity to do that outreach to the greater community. We have a really great representation on the task force itself. And we got some great work done. But the recommendations that we came up with stress that we would like to continue this work through creating an organization that can really, like I said, leverage our community and the resources to continue the work. So one is to be able to create that organization where we would appreciate funding to help with that. And then also to get a salaried position within that organization so that somebody can steer that and coordinate and be an advocate for us, as well as work with the city and the police department to further those goals and really give us the capacity to engage the entire community, the industry, the residential, the commercial, transportation, and the port as a whole, and build that coalition that can really come up with the best practices and answers for the problems that we're suffering right now.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity not only to participate in the task force, but to come here today. And I'm heartened to hear that your expectation wasn't that we come to the table with a fully developed product. We had a pretty sporty schedule. I'd like to talk about our recommendation for funding to develop a joint working group with SPD. This really goes back to your initial comments and the objectives around building upon the micro policing dashboard that already exists today, which is an excellent start. As a task force, we identified some potential solutions. We brainstormed some innovations involving policing strategies. However, we need to actively partner with South Precinct to work with them, benefit from their input, and their involvement and commitment. So it's a team effort, and we also want to recognize South Precinct has already demonstrated a strong willingness to engage with the community. So the working group and the output and the results from that group could potentially serve as a model for other neighborhoods. And so some examples of the innovative output that could be developed between this SPD and community group would be to develop a community crime dashboard and management plan, which is kind of taking that dashboard metrics to the next level on a community level, incorporating those into the cadence of our conversations with SPD. It would be data-driven. It would be an ongoing tool that would gain results and foster more focused and consistent attention to issues. This would be a measurable plan that we would work with them. I'd love an opportunity in the future to walk anyone through this who's interested. We've put some kind of notional examples in the report at the end. So some other examples of innovations that could come as a result of this team are things like community education on crime reporting, tools to improve communication, transparency, and collaboration between the precinct and community. So increasing that, working together. To that end, working together with the support of council members, we feel that we have an opportunity to make a measurable difference and create a model that is not just effective in Georgetown, but that could potentially be utilized by other neighborhoods. So, thank you.
One of the last things I want to mention too is, because of Georgetown's close proximity to industry, there are a lot of unique challenges. And we've had multiple efforts started to reevaluate zoning and try and figure out what has worked in other similar communities with similar issues. And so that's something that we'd also like to try and move forward and figure out a way that we can work together with industry and with commercial interests to try and find some things that will address the affordable housing crisis as well. Because that's it.
So do you have something in particular? Because I know I think your fourth recommendation is regarding a zoning study. So what did the task force discuss or envision would be part of that zoning study? What does it mean? What would the desired outcome be?
The desired outcome, I think, is to look and see what's worked in other areas. Because of the close proximity we have, there's just a lot of unique challenges that I don't think a lot of other neighborhoods have. But nationwide, there have got to be solutions that people have used to address this, and we're looking to do some investigation to find out what we could do to help improve the neighborhood to try and address some of these problems. I think the people in the task force necessarily have the answer, but what we're hoping is that we can find some solutions that have worked in other areas that we could leverage.
I think also,
Councilmember Johnson?
If I may, Mr. Von Brockhurst. So I'm the chair of the city's Land Use and Planning Committee, and we have heard this request not just from Georgetown, but from other neighborhoods that have similar linkage challenges between industrial and residential demands, whether that's in SoDo, whether that's in sort of Ballard, Inner Bay, whether that's in other parts of the city. Georgetown is, of course, unique because of not just the industrial lands, but all the other uses that are happening in the neighborhood. So we have had an industrial lands task force that several members of the Georgetown community have sat on for the last couple of years. That work has been kind of stalled out. But one of the work products that was highlighted as part of that is some of the work in Los Angeles to create a more mixed-use zoning capacity to allow for next generation industrial uses to happen on a ground floor level, and then to allow for some residential units on top of that. There's been some really great synergy in some of those parts of Los Angeles where you create that opportunity for revitalized commercial space, but you also create more residential units, so it gets at that dual issue of how do we find new commercial spaces that work for the new industrial that's happening throughout the city and throughout the world, but then also how do we get more eyes on the streets in parts of the neighborhood that may not have those sort of 24/7 eyes on the streets because they go dead from 4 or 5 p.m. until 7 or 8 o'clock the next morning. So a lot to come on that, but rest assured that that's something that my office and the folks in the planning department are very interested in partnering with you on. If I may, just a follow-up question, Madam Chair. One of the things that I really appreciated about your statements was the idea of a replicable outcome. And I think having educated individuals about the way that we talk about reporting of crimes and the dashboard, I think, is a really important first step. But what was missing there for me is what changes in the response from the police department as part of that. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, as we think about a replicable, thank you, that's a hard word for me to say.
It is very hard.
It's a replicable micro-policing strategy that's updated based on the micro-policing strategies that we have right now. What does that look like? Does it look like, what's your vision? What would it look like?
Okay, my vision is contained at the end of the report. There's some notional. I'd give you page numbers, but I don't think there's specific page numbers. But there's some notional examples there.
Yeah, I think it's Appendix H.
Yeah, so I think it's a fairly standard model. It's not anything I invented or anything new, but it's incredibly effective. So you come up with metrics, right? And you have target lines where you want to go. Right? And then what are your plans that are going to support you getting there? So you've got your plan, you've got your metric, and you have a cadence, right, where you're meeting with these folks. You're talking about it. You've got the owners clearly identified on the plans. And, hey, how are we doing? Are we meeting our targets? Are we not? What's working? What's not? So you're consistently doing this plan, do, check, act, right? It's a living item. And the data, I believe, that we need to make this work already exists today in the form of available metrics and dashboard. And so I think it's a matter of getting the community at the table with SPD, figuring out what our priorities are. For example, right? Let's say we want to reduce property crime in Georgetown by 15% over the next 8 months or something, right? So we put together a plan. What do we think that looks like? Okay, so maybe that means some more bike patrols. Maybe that means, something from the community. So we have those very specific items. And then we have the data that shows, are we being effective? No. right? It's going to go up, it's going to go down. So we'll be able to make course corrections and evaluations along the way. And the idea is then you take that plan and it just becomes part of the ongoing conversation, like at community meetings or whatever, right? It's not a special thing. It gets integrated into the cadence and the DNA of the working relationship of the organizations.
And would the funding request that you guys have made basically be to create a staff member within an organization to facilitate that type of dialogue and objective outcomes?
Well, I think that that's part of it, right? Is that not only do we need funding to support the working group interface, but also what Sam was talking about, to have a member of the community that's working with this individual to implement this kind of model.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I may add just a little bit to that, the idea of creating this full-time position of an advocate for the community and starting that brainstorming process with the police department, sitting down at the table and finding those new ideas. A lot of the current ideas are doing great. We'd like to do better. So finding the ways that we could really brainstorm that with the police and their expertise and what they've been doing and what's been working on their side and what hasn't, and how we as a community can help them help us.
If I may also comment on the resource, the funding for the resource that we're requesting, is that we understand that that's a finite, right, position, and that our end goal to that is to use that resource to develop this model that can kind of live on its own and then be kind of taken over by the community, right? There's a handoff at the end. It's not an abdication.
Okay. It's a little different than how the public safety coordinator has historically functioned. So it's, I think we're going to hear from the Chinatown International District folks in a short while on a similar topic. But historically, the public safety coordinator position has worked in the sense that it is community driven. So it's not owned by the police department. It's the advocate already is someone who is housed within community at a nonprofit organization that already has organic connections to members in the neighborhood, because that's what needs to happen in order for people to feel like they know who to go to, and sort of it then becomes the public safety coordinator's job to really cut through the bureaucracy and get answers to public safety concerns and needs that might not be as easily accessible to the ordinary person living and working in the neighborhood who just doesn't have the time to, spend hours on the phone trying to figure out who to talk to about X, Y, Z. And so I just want to make sure that when you talk about the public safety advocate, that your vision or the task force vision is effectively to find somebody to do to play that kind of a role.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is the intent. It's also the intent that this position and this organization will become self-fulfilling, that we're asking for a jump start. We're asking for a way to get that organization built, get it staffed, and get the work started. And then that person and the organization will work to make it so that it is long-term sustainable on our own.
So Georgetown, so in the task force's view, Georgetown doesn't currently have an organization that is a nonprofit organization that could house the position?
We do. I mean,
Okay.
the Georgetown Community Council does a lot of these different types of efforts, and I think there would be a good way to partner there.
Okay.
It's really about building a coalition, though, of the existing organizations and bringing together not just the community council, but the Merchants Association, the industry, bringing people together so that we can, as a holistic approach to the neighborhood. So while I think our intent is that the community council could be the home base for it, but that we really want to build a bigger coalition of everybody so that we are doing better for the whole community.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Nothing? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to be late. I was looking through the materials, and wondered if you could comment a little bit more about the lack of grocery stores, the fact that this is a food desert, how we make a livable, walkable community, I think are many of the things that Councilmember Johnson spoke about, how we create density and the ability for families to live in the communities that they work and to continue to allow for industry to thrive. Please point me to it if it's not in the document here, or I'm sorry, if it is in the document, but I didn't see a reference to the food desert aspect of Georgetown. And when I've thought about where to live, I've considered Georgetown. And having worked just around the corner in South Park for a number of years, we know that there's been multiple attempts to try to have grocery stores there, and they haven't stayed around. So wondering how the conversation may include grocery stores, affordable corner markets that have fruits and vegetables, additional pea patches. We know there are some, but how we can get more, and just frankly access to healthy, fresh foods in the neighborhood is something I'd be very interested in. And I think it's not just about nutrition, it's about that community spirit, and that social cohesion and interaction does help with public safety in the long run and wanting more people to live in the neighborhood. So is that part of the conversation you have, and is it in here?
I don't know if it's actually in the document, but that is absolutely a part of the conversation that we have as a neighborhood. As I mentioned, we have a ton of unique challenges. The lack of a grocery store is absolutely one that's always at the top of the community's list. When we were looking at this, our primary focus here was on crime, the causes of crime, and those types of things. But the lack of a grocery store, the food desert aspect of Georgetown, is absolutely a problem that we need to try and solve. And if we can make that a part of the conversation, there would be a ton of support from the community there.
Yeah, I would add too that the recommendations that we have outlined here are, just an excerpt of others in the report, and that was definitely there was a large portion of our time that was spent talking about what viability is and what is a vibrant community, and that was definitely part of the discussion. Safety and vibrancy go hand in hand, right? More people on the streets, access to food, things like clean air. We have our own specific set of challenges, as you know, in terms of from an environmental justice perspective in South Duwamish Valley. So yeah, those elements are definitely in the plan in a more comprehensive regard.
And I did appreciate in the report a focus also as part of increasing the vitality and just public safety issues is really sort of focusing in on some of the infrastructure improvements that can be made within Georgetown. And last budget cycle, the community had some great successes in terms of advocating for greater connection with South Park, for example, and some infrastructure, pedestrian, street improvements to really help Georgetown feel both more connected and safer to walk and bike in. And so I'm excited to see that those efforts are continuing to be implemented by the city and were integrated, in fact, into the recent Duwamish Valley Environmental Report that was released last month, I think it was. And so we're going to continue to monitor those as part of the overall recommendations of the Public Safety Task Force. It really sort of highlights that the built environment, creating a safer infrastructure in terms of how people move around in the different modalities, is a critical part of public safety as well. And I noticed that in one of your in Appendix G, I think it is, you all talked about the metrics of, for example, increasing bike safety and sort of who the source is for evaluating that and what it would look like in 5 years from now, for example, if we were to meet the goal of improving cyclist safety in the Georgetown neighborhood. So I appreciate that level of granularity as well. Any other questions or comments from anyone? Tom, is there anything you wanted to add? Council President Harrell?
I was just going to make a comment. I was in my office monitoring the discussion very closely on one thing. It just seems like an outstanding product as we start to enter the budget cycle again. This gives us some good recommendations, a good template to start thinking about some strategies. So thank you for all your community work. It's deeply appreciated.
Just that Don will be continuing to work with Georgetown on capacity issues and some capacity building through the end of the year.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all again so much for all of your work and your ongoing engagement. I know that the work that you did on the task force was within a compressed period of time in a, under a particular structure, but I know that Georgetown is incredibly active, whether the task force exists or not. So I appreciate all the work that you've done both in the task force, but also outside of the task force to continue to advocate for the neighborhood needs in Georgetown. I think it's an incredibly important thing for you all to do. And I spent a lot of time in Georgetown as a West Seattle resident. So definitely want to keep it quirky.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and move along to our third agenda item. We're going to continue on this theme of public safety for today. So if you are here to present on the Chinatown International District Public Safety Survey, I will invite you to join us at the table. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Agenda item 3, Chinatown International District Public Safety Survey for briefing and discussion.
Well, I got to be by the computer.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I didn't intend to make today's committee meeting about public safety in District 2, but it happened to work out that way. So the only thing missing is we should have invited South Park as well. They would have completed the trifecta of the public safety task forces for this morning. So good morning. We'll go ahead and start with some introductions, and then we will kick into the presentation.
Hello, council members. My name is Jennifer Chow with the Department of Neighborhoods, and I just want to say that I appreciate the ability to be able to witness the good work that's being done for community by community and being at this table and hearing about the report and the results.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jamie Lee with the Seattle Chinatown International District Preservation Development Authority.
And I'm Jessa Timmer, the Executive Director of the Chinatown International District Business Improvement Area and also co-chair of the Public Safety Council in Chinatown ID.
Thank you. All right, let's get started.
All right, I'm going to move this closer. Okay, so thanks for everyone for being here today. For those of you that I think are new, which maybe might just be you, to hearing about this stuff, this is the third time that I've come to present to council about the Chinatown ID Public Safety Survey. It is not the third time we have conducted the survey. The survey has been done in the neighborhood for, I think, almost 20 years, but it is the first time, when we did it 3 years ago, it was the first time it was done in this model. Where we did a concerted effort to ask specific questions. It was on the heels of the death of Donnie Chin and the formation of the task force. And so just kind of that's the model that we have had, and that's what we have had moving forward in this kind of new iteration of public safety that we have in the neighborhood. So the presentation will be a little different than it has been in the last 2 years now that we have the Public Safety Coordinator on board and we have the formation of the Public Safety Council in the Chinatown ID. So I will be talking about the survey results, and then Jessa will kind of give you guys an update on the work that the coordinator and the task force has been doing this past year, since that has also been funded by the city. Feel free to interrupt me with questions, and I guess that's it. So the 2018 Public Safety Survey was conducted from January to March this year, 2018, by SCID PDA. Some of you also recall that in the past, Interim CDA has partnered with us on this survey. The funding was lost for that, so we flew solo on it this year. This year we were able to, we were in the 400 range last year. We got 588 respondents this year, so I was really happy with that. The number continues to grow. I expect it to plateau at some point. We did it with a range of ages, languages, and we asked questions about times affiliated with the CID, and we were able to do it in multiple languages, both online in multiple languages, in paper in multiple languages. We were able to print links to the survey in ethnic media in both Vietnamese and Chinese. Nobody took it on the Vietnamese side, but that's cool. And then went door to door with businesses, with paper surveys to make sure that they were able to take it. We had 2 drop-off locations, one at Viet Hoa and then one at our office at Hing Hei Coworks, where folks could bring the survey in and then also did it throughout our residences in the neighborhood. Obviously with a heavy concentration on the ones that we manage, which is about 8 properties in the neighborhood. Okay, and I just want to remind everybody that this survey is not a report card of how SPD is doing, but more so of the perception of public safety by the community in the neighborhood. And so they're not like public safety numbers of like how many 911 calls actually happen, but just how folks in the neighborhood perceive it. So this is some demographics really quickly first, so that you'll see that there was a pretty even spread of folks, 19 to 35, 36 to 54, and 55 plus that took this survey. We had only about 13 people under the age of 18 that took this survey. So I think this is telling us that we need to do a more concerted effort in the future to get children and kids to also take this survey. I told Cody when I came in that one of my graphs was wrong, and this is it. There was obviously not 35% transgender folks in the neighborhood, but to give you, so I couldn't change it. But there's actually about 300 females that took this survey, about 242 males, 3 folks that identified as transgender, and 11 that identified as other that took this survey. The primary language of folks that took the survey was 61% of them were English speakers, 31% spoke Chinese, 5% spoke Vietnamese, and then 4% spoke other. Some of the other languages would probably include Amharic, Tagalog, Spanish, and some of the other residents that we have within our buildings. One of the things that we found challenging is getting the Vietnamese community to take the survey. For those of you that don't know, the Vietnamese population in terms of residents is quite small in the neighborhood, so most of the folks that do attend the neighborhood and speak Vietnamese are either business owners or visitors, and so I'll tell you that sitting in Viet Hoa on a Saturday afternoon trying to get people to take a survey is not very successful. They don't want to stop. They're getting their groceries and they want to keep going. So one of the things that, and this is, I think I said this last year, that we want to work on is trying to get the Vietnamese community to take the survey. I think part of it will be how we structure the survey and shortening it because it is quite long, is a couple of the things that we're considering. One of the questions that I wanted to ask this year that I didn't get to ask in previous years was whether or not it was someone's first time taking the survey. And so it was overwhelmingly that it was a lot of folks first time, 74% of the folks that took the survey. And so one of the things I am concerned about is survey fatigue. This is the 3rd time, like I said, that we've been doing it in this manner. And so I think folks that have previously taken it may not see the importance of it. So I think one of the things that we also need to consider is, how do we get people to continue to see the importance of taking the survey and getting this data and information out? Overwhelmingly, the largest population to actually, their CID affiliation was residents to take this survey, and then employees of the neighborhood. Non-residents were next, and then visitors, non-resident / community members. So people obviously self-identify in that category, but we would attribute that to people that come to the neighborhood and are heavily involved in the work that we do in the CID. We did have a pretty small amount of people that were property managers or property owners that did take the survey, and they're a pretty important constituency in the neighborhood. They're also a smaller amount of people, so that might be part of the piece of that, why there's so few, but really continuing to focus on where we're falling back on folks that are participating in the survey. Any questions about demographics? It was just a quick overview.
Pretty straightforward. Thank you.
Yeah. So some of the key findings that we wanted to talk a little bit about. So this one was question 10, and the question was on a scale of 0 to 5, or 1 to 5, 1 being never safe and 5 always safe, how safe do you feel the Chinatown International District is in certain areas of the neighborhood? And so it's a weighted average, but the respondents felt the safest in Japantown and the least safest underneath the I-5 underpass. And overall, respondents just felt slightly safer in 2018 than they did in 2017 when we compare the numbers from last year. This is telling in terms of, I think, a lot of the work that we've been doing around activating, and there's a lot of been conversations about activating and improving the conditions under I-5. Last summer, not this past summer, but the one before, you'll recall that we had a heavy encampment underneath I-5, and I think there was a lot of concern about that, and I think that concern still is today, even though the encampment's been gone for over a year, so that was not surprising to me at all. Another question, question 15, was what times of day people feel the safest or the unsafest. And so obviously folks, also this is no surprise that people feel the most unsafe between the hours of 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. in the morning. And they feel it's the most safe between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. in the afternoon. Nothing more to say about that.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Jamie, I'm wondering, is there a lot of business activity in the Chinatown ID in the midnight to 5 a.m.? A lot of folks loading and unloading trucks, a lot of folks getting out of bars and restaurants.
Sure.
Is there any activity that
There's
is happening?
not really much. If there is, it's probably, there's not that many bars that are open late and that have that heavy of activity. I'd say maybe Busch Garden is the one that is the most at this point. There are some deliveries, but they probably start around 5 a.m. and so it's pretty dead. If you're actually in the neighborhood past 10 p.m., it's pretty dead and pretty quiet.
I don't spend a lot of time awake between midnight and 5 a.m., and so just helpful to know.
One year we tried to find the folks that were doing donuts on, what is that, in front of Oasis, and I only lasted till midnight, so, and then I went to bed. So, you know, me neither. Great, thank you. So the question was asked, the police do a good job of keeping the CID safe. This was question 18. And the answer shifted across the board. The folks who somewhat disagreed was 20% in 2017 and it increased to 35% in 2018. Not really sure, you know, what the anecdotal things about that, but unfortunate to see that there was a decline in faith in police. The perceptions of cleanliness in the neighborhood were mixed, as I have the BIA sitting next to me. In 2017, the percentage of agreed to somewhat agreed decreased. So in 2018, the percentage of somewhat agreed to disagree, somewhat agreed and or disagreed decreased from 40% to 30%. And then the folks that disagreed or agreed, or could neither disagree or agree, sorry, this is very confusing, basically stayed neutral, increased from 13 to 20%, which could tell us that people don't see that there was much of a change in terms of cleanliness in the neighborhood. We also asked questions about why folks did not report violent and nonviolent crimes, in other words, calling 911. So the top reason for not reporting a violent crime was that they believed that someone had already called. For respondents over age 36, it was that they had concern for their safety or belief that someone else called. And then for Chinese language respondents is that they also believe that someone else called. And then these are the top 5 reasons. On the sheet I give you guys, it's a little small, of why folks did not report a violent crime, that they didn't believe the police would follow up, they didn't want to get involved, concerned for their own safety, that someone else called, and that they didn't believe the police would do anything. We asked the same questions for not reporting a nonviolent crime. So the top reason for 18 plus is that they also didn't believe the police would follow up. For English language respondents is that they did not believe the police would follow up. And then for Chinese language residents, they also didn't believe the police would follow up, but they also were concerned for their own safety. And then the top 5 reasons were actually quite similar to the violent crimes as to reasons why folks didn't call the police, except for one of them being that they didn't feel it was an emergency in order for them to warrant to call the police. Any questions about the survey? That's kind of the end of that piece. We can obviously go back to some questions once Jessa does her part.
Okay, I don't see any questions.
Thank you. I can try for you.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Thank you all again for your time this morning. Our public safety coordinator, Sunny Nguyen, was originally going to present this information, but is unable to attend the meeting today. Sunny sends their apologies and thanks the council for the strong partnerships that led to much of the success around public safety improvements in the neighborhood over the past year, especially Council Member Gonzalez. Sunny has prepared these slides and some highlights from our first annual report to be published in the next couple of weeks for me to share on behalf of the CID Public Safety Council. Thanks. Throughout 2017 and into 2018, the CID Public Safety Task Force became the CID Public Safety Council, shifting its responsibilities from having developed the recommendations submitted to then Mayor Murray to managing and guiding the public safety team in the neighborhood and progressing those task force recommendations. Excuse me, I'm fighting a little bit of a cold. Those three team members are Sunny Nguyen as Public Safety Coordinator, funded by the city and housed under a SCIPTA contract, Vicki Lee as Community Engagement and Outreach Specialist with Seattle Police Department, and Jennifer Chow as Community Engagement Strategic Advisor with Department of Neighborhoods, who's here today. The upcoming report will include a bullet-by-bullet update on all of the task force recommendations originally proposed in the CID Public Safety Task Force report. 2017 was dedicated to establishing this team and creating the groundwork for success, which includes developing a charter, shifts in council membership under a shifting city executive team, and a lot of introductory outreach into the community. Our public safety coordinator also identified 3 priority areas based on this outreach and feedback from the community, the council, and the task force recommendations. They've categorized some of our key updates into these 3 priority areas.
Next.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
One of those 3 priority areas was around homelessness. According to the public safety survey results, homelessness was of high concern to respondents and a frequent subject of feedback provided to the public safety coordinator. We remain committed to ongoing communication and collaboration with DESC to find ways for the neighborhood to best support efforts to end homelessness while supporting the Navigation Center and its residents in being good neighbors in Little Saigon. Through advocacy work in partnership with organizations in other neighborhoods along the downtown corridor, we have worked with the mayor's office to create a plan to bring geographic-based outreach services back to the CID and Capitol Hill, and now including First Hill. With DON support, we've also begun convening a monthly meeting of homeless service providers in the area to figure out how to best support these organizations, as well as our neighborhood residents and businesses, in connecting homeless people to services. This convening began after shifts in DHS funding and no commitment from any outreach organization except for REACH to serve the CID with any regularity. Next one, thanks. Nightlife activation. As the survey highlighted, the CID has a reputation for being an unsafe neighborhood at night, although SPD's available crime statistics show that the neighborhood is safe in terms of personal crime. When it comes to public safety, perception is reality. To address the perceptions of the neighborhood, the CID Public Safety Council has worked with and supported a few efforts to improve public infrastructure and visibility. Jamie Lee and SCIPTA led a neighborhood lighting study resulting in a suite of recommendations for key improvements in lighting in the neighborhood. The public safety coordinator currently chairs the neighborhood's public realm work group, originally formed as part of the neighborhood planning framework process. This work group is creating a set of recommendations to improve public amenities, streetscapes with an eye towards crime prevention through environmental design principles. The public safety coordinator also serves in a supporting role for our neighborhood block watch, which is vital for communication in the neighborhood as our aging and limited English-speaking population does not utilize more common means of neighborhood communication like Facebook groups or Nextdoor. Next. Police community relations. A major thread through a lot of the original task force recommendations that formed the Public Safety Council, and a theme highlighted in the survey findings, is a need to cultivate the relationship between CID residents and the Seattle Police Department. One of the most exciting efforts to work on this has been the Coffee with Cops series of events. The Public Safety Council has held 3 events this year, one at Soup Shop in Little Saigon, one at Eastern Cafe, and most recently Pinball with Police at the Seattle Pinball Museum. These events have drawn more than 100 attendees total to build relationships between residents and police officers in more casual settings as opposed to structured forum formats or interactions only when crimes occur. Our public safety coordinator also served on the police chief search committee and would like to share that they are very, very glad that it is over and done with. After spending over 100 hours serving the city and selecting a police chief, Sunny has learned what every 80s teen movie has been saying. Sometimes the one you've been looking for was right in front of you all along. Finally, we have worked extensively to improve communications between the city and CID, helping to coordinate several listening interviews, walking tours, safety trainings, and other SPD events. The public safety coordinator also works with the CID BIA, that's us, to manage the camera footage in the neighborhood, having helped SPD identify suspects in several crimes throughout the last few years. So that concludes just some of the updates that we're working on in our annual report. If you have any questions at this time, or I'll go into recommendations next.
And we're going to have the annual report very
soon.
Very soon.
I was just going to ask, where is the annual report?
It's like that step before it's hot off the press.
Okay, great.
It's warming up.
Well, we're excited to see it.
All right. I'm also on the council.
So lastly, before we leave, we'd like to share with council recommendations from the Public Safety Coordinator and the Public Safety Council created to address some of the highlighted concerns from the survey and other feedback from the community. The first recommendation is continuing to fund enhanced sanitation efforts in the CID, especially the Little Saigon neighborhood. Clear sidewalks and alleyways are important to maintain regarding perceptions and reality of public safety. The CID BIA has fostered a great working relationship with Seattle Public Utilities on a number of these issues, and we want to see these efforts continue. And as you saw in some of those survey results, there's been mixed reviews about sanitation in the neighborhood. Next, as mentioned above, the Public Safety Council has worked with Capitol Hill and First Hill representatives and the mayor's office to include funding to restore homeless outreach programs in these neighborhoods within the mayor's budget for 2019. These programs are not only vital to making sure that all homeless residents in Seattle are getting their needs met, but also to ensure that our business owners and residents know who they can call or reach out to when they want to connect people with services. We count on council to approve the funding in the mayor's budget for these programs. Currently, interim CDA is working to receive city support to improve and activate the I-5 underpass connecting Little Saigon to the rest of the Chinatown ID neighborhood. We will let interim's hard work speak for itself, but we ask the council to support their efforts to revitalize what is considered the most dangerous part of the neighborhood. Another significant step towards improving public safety in the CID lies in the mayor's budget again. The mayor's proposed budget includes the first in funding to start addressing the poor lighting around the neighborhood that contributes to poor perceptions of public safety. We again count on council to approve this piece of the mayor's budget to ensure adequate and safe lighting throughout the district. One of the most common reasons for not calling the police, as according to the survey, as well as one-on-one conversations, was that police would not come. It is likely that this is not unique to the CID. With one of the smallest and, as often argued, most understaffed police departments for a city our size, we ask that council finds and supports strategies to improve 911 responsiveness across the city.
And that's it.
That's it.
All right, any questions or comments, colleagues? Okay. As usual, you all are very thorough. So we look forward to getting the annual report and hope to be able to get that before we begin our budget deliberations. So you can shoot it over to me and Cody, and we'll go ahead and make sure to distribute it to folks who are attending here today. And again, thank you all so much for your work that you're doing in the public safety realm in Chinatown International District. I know some of these numbers are moving and shifting, but I still see them trending generally in a better direction in terms of where we started 3 years ago as it relates to people's perception of public safety. So I think what that tells me is that the way that we have structured handling public safety issues through first the Public Safety Task Force that has now evolved into the Public Safety Council is a good model that is being responsive to neighborhood concerns, and we really appreciate you all continuing to be a voice and to continue to provide us an opportunity to support community-driven solutions that are clearly starting to trend in a better direction than they were when we started. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and a lot of the support from the people around the table, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and move to our fourth agenda item. So if you're here to present on the low acuity alarm program, I invite you to join us at the table while Cody reads this item into the record.
Agenda item 4, response to statement of legislative intent 195-1-A-1 and the low acuity alarm program.
Thank you, Cody. Good morning. We'll go ahead and start with introductions, and then I'll hand it over to you all for the presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Lisa Kay, Council Staff.
Good morning, Harold Scoggins, Fire Chief.
Good morning, John Ehrenfeld, Low Acuity Alarm Program Manager, Seattle Fire.
Good morning, Deputy Chief Mark Garthgreen, Seattle PD.
Okay, welcome all. Who is going to get us started?
I'll just give a brief tee up here.
Great.
So today's presentation pertains to Seattle Fire and Seattle Police Department's response to a statement of legislative intent, or a SLI, approved by the Council in November of 2017. The SLI requested a joint report on approaches used by the fire and police departments to connect 911 callers with social and health services or other resources for callers who are experiencing mental or behavioral health issues or who are reporting domestic violence or sexual assault. At this point, I would just turn this over to the departments for their presentation.
Great.
So the presentation is broken up into two parts. First part is Seattle Police Department, then we'll blend in after that, and then we'll have some closing comments and thoughts. So
wonderful.
Thanks, Chief. Chairman Gonzalez, committee members, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss the efforts that the Seattle Police Department commits to partnering with other city departments, specifically the Seattle Fire Department. I want to thank Chief Scoggins and the rest of the Seattle Fire Department for their collaborative efforts and the great working relationship that we have every day out there on the streets, keeping Seattle safe. Seattle is actually a model for other cities on how police and fire can actually interact and still have kind of a healthy rivalry at times.
I was going to say, I serve on the pension boards for both fire and Seattle, and it's always fun to hear the perspectives in those two different rooms.
It is, but we all share the same goal, and that's a much safer city.
That's right.
And we all come together at that point. And as the Chief Best reminds us often, the police department is on the front lines of poverty, mental health crisis, homelessness, and the tragedy and unpredictability inherent in the profession of policing. Our officers experience this every day, and they know they will never have all the tools necessary to deal with these, but we continually look to improve the tools that we currently have within the department, currently looking externally as well for any available tools there, and open to trying new things, and then embracing those when they do work. We've consistently demonstrated this with the success of the navigation team, the partnership with the LEAD program, and our own responses into behavioral crisis as well. If we'll go to the first slide, we'll look here for a moment. Oh, thanks. As you can see in the first slide, about 12% of our calls for service on views are for major person or property crime. The largest category of call type is the broad society at 27%. In the breakout chart beside it, you can see that most of these calls are for disturbances, many of which have some connection to substance abuse or behavioral issues, followed more traditionally by criminal disorder events, narcotics, prostitution, car prowling, such as those. But most important to today's conversation is that 22% of these calls, about 20,000 calls that are for people in crisis, some form of substance abuse issue or a casualty, a person down, sick or injured, a non-criminal nature one. Another important category to note is the miscellaneous section here, where 13% of these calls are for an assist for other agency. Now, some of these assists for other agencies are criminal in nature, but that's actually the lower percentage of that. The higher percentage is assisting other agencies with non-criminal incidents, working with fire, working with other agencies to try to resolve other issues. So when you take those together, we look at about over 10% of our dispatches involve issues that are non-criminal in nature, and at points are probably not best served by the criminal justice system, ones that we need to look elsewhere out for. And with this, a large percent of that are for folks in crisis. And I know that you're all familiar with our work on responding to people in crisis. And it's probably one of our main collaboration points throughout the city of what we're looking for and how to deal with that. So last year, SPD officers completed over 10,000 crisis templates in the city, which is an increase of about 12% from 2016. And we know right now that we have an even larger increase coming online for this year. We're already starting to gather that data. In the second slide, you can see the distribution of the dispatch crisis calls in 27 with the percentage increases in each precinct that we saw over 2016. Obviously, North has got the highest with the largest geographical area, and is at about 32%. So the top number is actually the percentage of the calls, and then the bottom number is actually the increase over the last year. It's a little hard to see, but we're seeing a dramatic increase all over through the city that's affected by this.
Deputy Chief, are these, just so I know what we're looking at, are these, because it says crisis calls, are these ones that have been verified by the police department as being an actual crisis, or are these just calls that are made reporting a crisis,
No.
whether it is or is not?
So they are ones that we've verified, that officers have been on scene, completed a crisis template, and then looked at it from that perspective. And then that's the number we're capturing there.
Great, thank you.
So if we'll go to the next slide, we'll look at the disposition of the calls as well that are currently available to our officers. The most frequent outcome of a crisis contact is either an emergent detention, where we feel that there's a great possibility of harm either to themselves or to another person, or just the inability to care for themselves, which could induce harm at that point. The second largest one then suddenly becomes no action possible or necessary. Together, these two categories speak to the need for more options for the first responders. And I guess not stepping too far ahead, but that is the overall ask of the department. It's not for money, not for officers, not for anything along those lines, but we truly need alternatives that become available to us to have outreach, to have resources for dealing with folks in crisis that negate the use of a hospital or a jail facility.
Yeah.
What's that little baby red one that's gone up 76% that doesn't have a tag?
I'll ask Dr. Fisher. I know he put this together.
We can get that one. We didn't have it on there just because it's only 3% of the total, but so it's a small numerical change. But we can get you. I don't have right here what the number is, but we can get you that.
Well, I wasn't curious about the number. I was curious about which of the categories. Oh, the categories.
Yeah.
Okay.
So along with that, we do have an extensive background of training for our officers with the crisis intervention training that we do and bias training as well and different things. And what we find with that is, with that encompassing it in a look for the crisis calls, we see that very few of the incidents, really only about 9%, a little over 9% of our incidents result actually in arrests. And within that, too, only 1.7% of those actually end up using force. So what we're seeing there demonstrates the fact that our training is very valuable to our officers to engage with people in crisis And when they're in crisis, the view of authority showing up can sometimes send them farther into crisis. And then as well as cars with lights and different things will enable that. So we work very hard in training our officers to de-escalate, to calm down, and then to get to sometimes the root of the problem if we can, and then try to figure out which best way to send our folks. But unfortunately, the amount of resources that we have is very shallow, that pool, for us to send people to, and that's where we really need to start focusing on from the city. The next few slides kind of outline the key points within the the extensive response that Seattle PD, Seattle Fire, and the CBO put together. I'm just going to kind of hit the high points on that. The department's response to behavioral crisis has received national attention, as we've talked about before. Both our crisis intervention program and the crisis response unit have worked together to provide exceptional service across the city and training to the officers on the street. We provided a tremendous amount of training to outside resources as well, other city agencies, such as like the library. We're partnering with them and assisting them with crisis training as well, since they're also on the forefront of seeing a lot of folks who don't have any place to go, obviously go in and seek shelter during the day there. But with that, so the crisis intervention program, again, one of the only programs in the country. The goal is to identify the needs and barriers and then work within that, and to work with public health and work with Harborview Hospital and others as well to work with it. The crisis response unit responds to the continuity of care. They review the reports, and they do a lot of personal contacts. We use a ride-along program right now, which is when we assess folks that are exhibiting different stages of crisis and put a plan, a management plan, if you will, into how officers can deal with them. Officers can actually access this prior to going to the call or once on the call, and to see various triggers and different things and outreach, and if there's a caseworker assigned, so we can contact that person directly, rather than having to get them into the system and then have the system try to find that caseworker. We're able to do that and work with that. Training to the streets. The Crisis Intervention Committee, obviously SPD's Crisis Intervention Program is advised by the CIC, Voluntary Interagency Advisory Committee, and again, constantly evaluating how we approach our business in dealing with folks in crisis and what are better options out there. And again, latest technology and different things, always evaluating how we get better at this. So that's kind of in a brief nutshell on the crisis portions. I'm going to move momentarily to...
Deputy Chief, I know that there's some technologies that are being used by King County. Councilmember Bagshaw mentioned this to me in the hallway yesterday, that there are some technology that is available to law enforcement that effectively allows a greater synergy between our records management system and how we connect or want to or need to connect people to additional resources. Is that something that are you aware if that's something that the department is interested in looking at or has been looking at?
Yes. So we are evaluating all of that. Part of that is encompassed, like I said, with the ride-along program. Right. And then beyond that, King County just moved to the Mark 43 RMS system, which we're moving to, which will also give us greater collaboration with them, this is a regional issue. It's not one that's systemic to Seattle. And so the ability for us to share information through the new RMS system and the new technologies that are coming online, and then to be able to put that out frontline, and then looking at how we share that with public health and with our local hospitals. And then working together. An illustration was in that collaboration point, Seattle Children's Hospital we have a tremendous amount of calls for service to the hospital to assist them with folks that are in crisis that are actually there for treatment for their affliction. And so we did some work with them on when to call the police, when it would be appropriate, and then what we can do to assist them. And through those efforts and committee that Captain Sean O'Donnell actually started up there, we've reduced that number of calls dramatically. So on that end, it looks good. But the overall effect of that is there's far better patient care and management going on of people in crisis. So continually looking and striving for that to get that information with our partners that are also seeing this.
Great, thank you.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here to domestic violence and sexual assault. So the department has invested heavily in responding to and protecting victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. So we employ a team of victim advocates, 8 FTEs within the department. Then they in turn are then supported by a victim support team with it. So we have victim advocates on staff, and they normally get referrals from the officers from reports, or they can be contacted just by the public, and then they will assist them in filing reports, and as well as we get referrals from the prosecutor's office. So they are dedicated to the person and working through the entire process with that person, taking them from right after the incident all the way through the resolution of the court case. So we invest in them with what they need, and then how we can assist them with that, whether it be relocation. We have funds available where we've moved families. We've gotten storage units for folks. We've paid for bus tickets for folks who don't reside in the area to come in to adjudicate their court cases and then return home. We've got food vouchers. We transport children. So this group does a tremendous amount for us outside that. We're also hopeful that the CSO program, when that comes online, that'll be an additional benefit to that as well. Concurrently with that, we have the victim support team, which is a group of dedicated volunteers that work on the weekends, and they have police radios come in and check in with us with the roll calls, and then officers request them directly. So as the officers respond to a scene at that period in time, we're able to get a victim support team member out initially right there to help quell the situation, to be a friend, to be a crutch, somebody that they can lean on in this extreme time, and help them through the process, and then be there also once the officers leave, to be a supportive person there to allow for another family member, a friend, or somebody to go and offer support as well. And those folks do sometimes continue with them, but normally the traditional then would be a handoff to our domestic violence advocates, and that'll move through the program.
I really appreciate the work that you all are doing in this space. I think when we look at some of the root causes of what precipitates folks entering into a state of either housing instability or homelessness, domestic violence and sexual assault is very, very high on the list. And so I think the more that we can do to make sure that we are connecting people to the services they need and creating a safe space for them to heal and recover is a really important strategy for us in terms of the front end prevention issues. It's not just a law enforcement perspective, but it is a harm reduction approach to making sure that the victim is connected with services that he or she might need to continue to stay in place and feel safe wherever it is they might end up being. So I appreciate the work that you guys do here.
Thank you. And one of the other things that we're working with on that, and it goes actually to reference to what I was talking about with the international district slides earlier, where a lot of people don't want to call the police, don't want to get caught in things. So we have programs in place where it's kind of go through the process at your own pace, or kind of pick your track, is, if you will, of what to do, where we'll take anonymous reports. We will, just to gather the statistical information also then, and then to work to identify perpetrators and other things as well, where they might not be adjudicated under that case, but to prevent them from doing others, and also to see some outreach on those. So we have a variety of different options that we're working with to tackle that bit.
That's great.
As well. We do work with Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network as well in handling prolific and disturbing cases based on labor and sex trafficking. And we set a very high bar on this. Our focus on this is victim-centered, where we get in there, and really what we're looking to do is rescue the victims in this industry. We work with the federal government to ensure that we can have T visas available, so that there's no immigration issues, that people aren't concerned about their immigration status, that we will get victims and witnesses of that visas so that they can stay and work towards different things. Coupled with that is, while we're here, if people are just moved away from the area on that, most countries don't have the resources that we do. And so not only are we looking at it from a judicial standpoint, criminal justice standpoint, we're also looking for the fact that the longer that we can have the folks here and assist them, the better resources we can offer them to kind of heal and work through the process. So we partner with that. To ensure that all the victims, survivors, of family, and witnesses, as I said, we work very hard with that. Overall, looking at it as a global look, the department really stresses this to the officers, to the investigators on these types of different cases, and really works hard around RSJI, Race and Social Justice, with this by working with our bias-free training policies, with immigration policies, where we are dedicated to equity and equality of service, which the department mandates and obviously the city expects as well. And then our CIT training works in conjunction with that as well. So just in closing, we cannot address the issues alone. We know that. That's why Seattle Police Department has an extensive network of partnerships, agreements, and contracts with so many city, county, state, and non-governmental organizations. I believe the next slide has a listing of quite a few of them here. And we are always looking for more. If there are groups out there that we could partner with, we would be happy to partner with you to bring more services to the citizens of Seattle. We're always open to that. The navigation team is a success, works very hard with HOST, has a great relationship with that, and working now with the Seattle Fire Department as well, when we're going out to homeless environments as well, to interact and intercede in those areas, because we do know that there's a large breadth of crisis issues around there, and we also know there's a lot of domestic violence, sexual assault, and criminal opportunities out there in those camps that we're trying to negate and then rescue the folks from that as well and get them out of that lifestyle and get them to somewhere where they're healthy. What I hope I've made clear is that we're already working closely with Seattle Fire and other agencies, and we will continue to strive to increase the collaborative nature and open the doors to more and more. As we're working through these things, anecdotally, I'll tell you, the other day we had several opioid overdoses. And within a few hours of getting that information, we were working with Harborview, the medical examiner's office, and the Department of Health, and working through that, and I believe Seattle Fire as well, from those calls. And just a great working relationship. Found out very quickly some of the causes, found out that we did not need to do a public service announcement immediately on it, as they were all different. But it was a great example of that collaborative work that we're really pushing towards, and then looking at it on a regional level as well. As we hold most of the resources in King County here for those folks, we do know that they may not live here, but they will come here and utilize those services. So when they go home, how do we partner with those other agencies to assist them in ensuring everybody has adequate care? So as I said, what we really need are just more options for our officers. When they're out there, when they're encountering somebody, what can they do? Who can they refer that person to and get that help? We have the mental health professionals that are out there, crisis intervention, but we need more. And the availability of that to either come and take that person directly, or for a way for us to have that person transported to them for more help.
Are there certain precincts that experience greater difficulty than others as it relates to having somewhere to refer a person that is in crisis that officers might come in contact with?
No, I think they equally share the burden on that. Geographically, the North Precinct sees a heavier burden because geographically it's bigger, it's also farther away. But as far as resources itself, probably North and South have less of ability in the sense that their resources aren't as close by. If I have someone in crisis down in Pioneer Square, I might be able to just walk across the street and find a provider to help them. Whereas in the North Precinct up in Lake City, they don't have that option. And so again, we're relegated to, unfortunately, the two options of walking away or having somebody enter into the system.
So when an officer comes into contact with somebody who's in crisis, how does that officer know who to call?
So they generally, what they will do is they'll try to assess what it is, and depending, again, the first thing that they're going to do is look at the level of threat, either to themselves or to somebody else. The person in crisis, if they're suicidal or something along those lines, and assess that level of threat. If the level of threat is high enough, then we will emergently detain them in order to keep them safe. So that person then would be transported to primarily Harborview Hospital, but other hospitals as well, to receive that care, where they're held until they can see a mental health professional, or they're assessed at the hospital and then released from there. We do have the mobile crisis team, which officers can call. So if it's not an emergent detention, but they believe that this person needs some help and the person is somewhat cooperative in the sense of they're willing to talk to somebody, we will call out the mobile crisis team and have them respond to speak as well. If it's during the times of operations of our crisis response team, we will call, and those officers will actually come out and respond and take over for that officer, free them back up to go do 911 calls, and they then will take that person. And they have built partnerships with a variety of different organizations, to include most of the mental health professionals in the area. And so they will then take them, transport them, or have the mental health professionals come out and reach them. So that's kind of where it works from there. But unfortunately, it's one of those, the officers have several numbers, but those numbers only work during certain periods of the day. And then they're left with the two options of either, or three options rather, arresting the person if there is a crime, involuntarily committing them if there's no crime but there's a danger, or walking away, creating a report, and when we forward that report on to the crisis response team, who then reviews the reports, they will go out and again make contact during working hours or refer it over to a mental health professional to make contact as well. But again, very limited. We would love, there's some grants and different partnerships out there with different agencies where they have mental health professionals on staff that actually work all hours and are partnered with a police officer where they can respond and then kind of take better charge and better care of that person. And we were looking towards getting a grant through Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. That didn't come to fruition. And the reason being is because they hold our program in such high esteem. They're actually looking for folks who don't even have what we have. So again, we've kind of set the bar, but we're not nearly where we need to be for that.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that.
So I just want to
Any questions for the Deputy Chief before we move on to fire? Okay.
So, Councilmember Gonzalez, I want to thank you and your committee for paying attention to this very complex issue that we're facing out there. And I want to thank SPD and Chief Best and Deputy Chief Garth Green, because the partnerships are very important for our success out there in the field. John's going to go through a number of slides, but I just want to kind of plant a seed that we have to start thinking differently of how we provide services to people. We have a very traditional system where someone calls 911, we send all of our fire resources, and we can only take them to a hospital. That's a very traditional system. And when John goes through the slides, you're going to understand that a lot of our calls, that's not what people need. So we have to create different pathways to provide the services that people need. And that's what we just heard from SPD. I think you said 10% of that population are getting arrested, something to that effect?
10% of our calls are non-arrest situations where, just like you said, they need a different path, an individualized program and assessment.
And our percentage is even higher than that. A lot of our 911 calls, especially our EMS calls, 40%, we're not transporting. We're leaving them where they sit. They're not advanced life support. And that's very important. And you're only getting the EMS perspective here. You're not getting the total fire perspective, because many of our grass, brush, and bark fires and house fires and abandoned buildings are from the same population that we're talking about here. So we have to try to think through and create different avenues. And when John gets done, we can talk about that some more.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. Let me very briefly acquaint you with sort of the two overarching goals of the low acuity program. One is sort of an internal goal, and that is to improve the responsiveness of our fire units and to ensure that they're available 24/7 to respond to fires, rescues, and other major emergencies. The second goal is sort of a more externally focused goal, and that is ensuring that callers who are calling for things that are not critical emergencies are connected with more appropriate, more therapeutic, and more timely resources than just the ER. And really it's somewhat of a win-win situation in that if we are successful in that second goal and connecting people with better and more appropriate resources, that will help us with our first goal of improving response times, improving unit availability, and general efficacy of achieving kind of our major mission as the fire department. Let me acquaint you very briefly with just a couple background statistics. When we look at the program, primarily, as the chief said, from the emergency medical services side, when our firefighters fill out an electronic healthcare record for any patient contact, they have to provide sort of a rough triage of that patient, and that is, critical, which is typically at the paramedic level, emergent, which is really at the EMT level, or lower acuity, which is a huge, very broad category of anything that is not an immediate life-threatening emergency. And so that 43% is just a staggering number. So, 4 out of every 10 runs that our rigs are going on are not for a critical emergency. And that encompasses everything from social conditions, conditions involving homelessness, chronic medical conditions, people who don't know how to navigate the healthcare system. It's a very large and varied burden of calls. And I think from our perspective, it is both a huge burden on our units, but it's also a huge opportunity because, again, that 43% are potentially a large category of patients whom we could be more effectively redirecting towards more timely, more therapeutic services and really more appropriate outcomes than, as the chief said, either just leaving them on the scene or taking everyone to the emergency department. So it's a big opportunity for us, I think, to kind of rethink how we provide these services. I want to focus as well on the homelessness population, and we don't have comparative historical data here. This tool in our healthcare records we really only began using in February, but just based on those numbers, they are quite staggering. So we are looking at approximately right now 20% of our EMS contacts throughout the entire city of Seattle pertaining to homelessness. That will total somewhere in the vicinity of 16,000 responses a year. It's just an enormous number. So you're looking at somewhere in the vicinity of 1% of the population of the city of Seattle generating about 20% of its EMS runs. And really the main issue here is that our units, our engines, our ladders, our aid cars just don't have at hand a lot of specialized resources and tools for interacting with this patient population. Specifically looking at behavioral health emergencies and substance abuse, I just want to direct your attention to some of our statistics, again, from EMS contacts. So our providers have to choose what they call a primary impression, and that's really the main thing that they're seeing that day. And so if you just look at the top of the list in terms of what we see in a given time period, a huge percentage of them are correlated very strongly with behavioral health emergencies or substance abuse. So alcohol use is perennially the top one in that category. That no complaints or injury illness noted, that could be anything under the sun where they didn't have a complaint. So it could be someone was sleeping in an alley and a good intent bystander called 911 and they wake up and say, I'm fine, all the way to, someone in a long-term care facility. It's a large category, but it is huge. It is so highly represented in what our rigs are seeing on the street. These are not critical emergencies. These folks are not going lights and sirens to the hospital. And then you see at the bottom as well the opioid crisis represented pretty strongly there. As a percentage goes, alcohol is a far bigger challenge for us, but certainly opioids are a daily burden as well. So I'm going to very quickly go over what is located in the slide as far as the topics.
Councilmember Mosqueda.
Just a quick question on the previous slide. I assume some of these are co-occurring.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you're not just having to select one. People are self-medicating potentially.
Yeah, these are highly co-occurring.
Okay.
Behavioral health on top of physical health conditions, on top of substance abuse. In the moment, the provider has to choose the most appropriate, but in reality, they're certainly quite co-occurring.
So they are choosing one then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And their supporting documentation will list the others, but
I see.
this is sort of a very high-level view of it.
Okay, I think that's an important data point as well. And then just generally, as you mentioned, given that there are a number of individuals who would be more appropriately served outside of a hospital or in a mental health setting or substance abuse setting instead of either going to jail or going to the hospital, I know from the work that I was able to shadow you on last year that we're not having to reinvent this. We're not creating, this from scratch. There's other cities that are doing this well. So just before we go on into the slide details, can you give us another sense of the other cities that are doing a good job of identifying alternatives either to jail or hospitals?
Well, first I'll compliment our city, because I believe we are doing it well. We just don't have enough resources. So since John's come on board with our social worker in the fire department, we're doing very good case management where we're directing people to services. That's very important because that's what they need. They need case management. But some of the fire departments around the country that are doing this well, some are right here in King County. In the south end of the county, they have an FD Cares unit and with firefighters and nurses. Another part of the county, they have a firefighter and a social worker on an ambulance responding.
Can you talk about which parts of the county you're talking about? Kent?
Puget Sound. Fire department is Kent. What are all the agencies?
And then South King Fire and Valley, which is, the South County region.
Great.
Right.
Okay.
So they have a firefighter and a nurse responding. In Shoreline, they have the firefighter and a social worker responding. And then in other parts of the country, they're responding. They have community paramedicine programs with similar footprints that are going to meet people and do follow-up visits, and they're trying to take these calls out of the system. But what I see as a commonality is that social work component. We can throw a lot of firefighters at it, but we have a limited skill set. The social workers have the skill set that can actually connect people to services to reduce the number of times they're calling 911 because they're getting health care, they're getting housing, they're getting all the things that they can provide. That becomes very important.
Thank you for that. I think it's an important element as we go into budget, especially when I know many of us have done ride-alongs with the fire department. I have not yet done with the police, but when I did my ride-along with the fire department, every single call was related to an item on this list on slide 12. None of them were related to fire. So I think that the more that we can help identify additional support so that we can continue to be leading the nation and the Puget Sound region in how we partner with case managers, social workers, and healthcare providers is a great example of where we're both being cost efficient and saving lives.
And Chief Scoggins, I know that you mentioned before John started digging into the slides that you wanted to have a conversation about sort of how do we innovate in this area and how do we approach it differently. And one of the things that I'm interested in continuing to have a conversation about is the perception by the general public that this is the low acuity issues are a policing issue, for example, the issue is that folks don't know who else to call, and so they call 911, and that immediately becomes an SPD, SFD issue. And how do we create a public awareness about who they should call if they see somebody in crisis. And I think that, that's an area where I think we could greatly innovate with the assistance of you all. Oh, God. It's a good thing there was no water in that. With the assistance of you all to sort of think through sort of how do we create that general structure, right? Is there a different number people can call that isn't 911 that is more appropriate for triaging situations of people who are in crisis, who, folks who call that number, the person on the other line automatically can figure out how to diagnose and figure out who should respond. And sometimes that might be SPD, sometimes that might be the fire department, but sometimes it's just a social worker, right? Or a nurse or somebody else. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to continue to have a conversation around sort of how to really just transform the entire system so that it doesn't continue to be the perception that this is a law enforcement responsibility, because sometimes it just is not. And I think the statistics that you're showing us show us that in a large percentage of cases, it is not a law enforcement issue. It's just that you all are the only ones available at this point, and readily accessible to the general public to lodge these concerns.
I would just echo as well, going back to what the chief said regarding other units, and particularly I'd direct your attention in the slide to the programs they have in San Diego and in Colorado Springs. And I would say at the highest level, there's two aspects of all of these very successful, innovative programs. One is that they're multidisciplinary. Like the chief said, the expertise is not just within the fire department. They have to reach out to the police, to social work, to behavioral health. And the other aspect, I think, is that they have to be mobile. They have to be able to go and meet this patient population where they're at. And I think that's what you see in all of these programs around the country that are having so much success. So turning very briefly to domestic violence and sexual assault, really kind of our role in that spectrum is recognition and notification of SPD, and that occurs both at the dispatch level if it's recognized at that stage or on scene certainly by our firefighters. And we have done department-wide training on recognition of domestic violence incidents and referral over to the police. And then since this slide was published, we've also designed and rolled out to every single one of our firefighters a training on human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children, and that focuses both on recognition and reporting. Moving to behavioral crises at the dispatch level when they're recognized, we've been updating our protocols somewhat, and we are currently diverting a slightly larger percentage of them right now to SPD, and that is with the recognition that right now SPD has more specialized resources on call and available than we do, specifically regarding behavioral health crises, and primarily that refers to crisis intervention trained officers and to the crisis response unit. We do sometimes directly send them to AMR when appropriate, and then when we roll out our new emergency medical dispatch protocols, which will be near the end of this year or the beginning of next year, we're going to be offering callers a direct link to the King County crisis line as well, again when appropriate. When our units are on the scene, they have several options for behavioral crisis resources. We've provided training on asking for SPD crisis intervention trained officers. Previously, our firefighters weren't aware that that was a specific resource that they could request, and we've trained our dispatchers in the fire alarm center as well. Like the police, we are also increasingly heavy users of the mobile crisis team. They're a fantastic resource for us. Really the one issue that we have is just their limitation in terms of response times and availability. But as far as providing services to persons experiencing homelessness, persons in behavioral health crises, they have such a wealth of knowledge and understanding and ability to take patients to more therapeutic locations like the Crisis Solutions Center. That really, I think, is also a model of what works very well in Seattle. And we use as well the King County Emergency Services Patrol, better known as the sobering van, quite a bit. The single biggest request I think that we hear is for greater geographic coverage. They really only cover the downtown core down to Soto and North Beacon Hill, and so more sobering options. As I showed in the previous slide, the number of alcohol-related contacts is just stratospheric. And so again, that's a program that I think could really stand to expand both geographically, also in terms of their scope, and in terms of low acuity patients that they take. And I want to just direct your attention as well to this graph of our usage of the mobile crisis team. We kicked it off in June of 2016. You can ignore that April 2018 data point. That's a missing point. We did actually make referrals in April of this year.
I was going to say April looked pretty.
It was not a quiet month. We were just missing those data, but the trend is very obvious. And I think what we're seeing here is firefighters recognizing how valuable a resource it is, and that's my program going around and providing training around the city to firefighters on this. My expectation is this number will continue to rise. And what we see here is the need, again, for that warm handoff, that professional to professional handoff for patients who are in the most crisis at the moment of. And for them, just a referral-based option is really not ideal. You need a professional to professional handoff. Looking at after the call, we really have kind of two major venues for those patients. One is the low acuity high utilizer program, and just to contextualize that for you, in the last 6 months, we had over 1,400 individuals in the city of Seattle who had 3 or more contacts with EMS. We had more than 100 individuals with 10 or more contacts with EMS. Our staffing for the program right now is 1 full-time social worker from Aging and Disability Services. So obviously the volume of the problem far exceeds 1 case manager. That would be a very large caseload for her. There's an enormous need for case management and referral services, again, as the chief mentioned. And our other major post-call referral program is our vulnerable adult program. That's for elderly or disabled individuals in cases of abuse or neglect. And again, we've seen a steady rise in reporting since that program launched. And that's a cooperative program with SPD, Adult Protective Services, and Aging and Disability Services. At this point, we average probably 1 vulnerable adult referral per day in every single part of the city. It doesn't track at all with socioeconomics that we've been able to tell. Every single part of the city has these. And again, the need for case management there is huge. It's been a very, very successful program connecting people with resources. And then we do a lot of ad hoc referrals to entities such as the SPD NAV team, to reach case managers, to DESC host, et cetera. And some of these are documented here and are in the slide. Let me just quickly conclude with both some current shortfalls as our program sees it, as well as some opportunities for the future. As we mentioned, we have a huge volume of lower acuity alarms and few non-ED transport options. Right now, our basic life support provider, which is AMR, they do not transport patients to any destination except the emergency room. There may be some hope on the horizon for getting that shifted, but for now, primarily because of billing reasons, they cannot get reimbursed for any transport except to an emergency room, so they have no incentive to take patients to specialty care centers, to clinics, to primary care, to sobering, to crisis solution, any of the places we would rather divert these patients as opposed to taking them to Harborview, they cannot transport them. So changing that dynamic, I think, would be hugely, hugely beneficial for
Is that
SFD.
a state law or federal law regulation?
It would be federal, because a lot of the reimbursement comes from
Based on
Medicaid
reimbursement.
and Medicare, which comes from CMS, which is the challenge.
Yeah.
Another acutely felt issue within the fire department is, we do not have specialized crisis, low acuity, or homelessness rigs on the street. We have that in the low acuity program, but they're not out there on the street. Again, comparable to SPD, they have the crisis response unit. So, having a dedicated unit or individual or body of individuals to take this call volume specifically, I think, the numbers show they would be very busy on a daily basis. Council member, you mentioned the need to have some sort of additional resource at the call-taking level. We absolutely concur. Our dispatchers are under incredible time pressure. They have to process the calls extremely quickly, which almost always invariably leads to just dispatching a unit. They send out an engine, they send out a ladder truck. More resources at the fire alarm and the call-taking level to divert some of these patients away from the 911 path. We certainly concur there would be a need for it. And in the slide, if you look at the example of Fort Worth, Texas, they're doing very interesting work down there with putting nurses in their 911 center.
And indirectly, we tested that. We gave DESC a contact number for a nurse line before they called 911, and we were able to measure how often those calls were diverted from the 911 system, and it was successful.
Great.
Yeah, approximately 80% of those calls were not being kicked back to 911. So it was very successful in that trial.
Yeah, and that Fort Worth, Texas, the MedStar mobile healthcare example that you put in the slide response, it talks about how MedStar estimated that its nurse triage program saved $2.62 million over 4.5 years due to avoided ambulance and ED costs. So I definitely think that's a model worth looking at to see how we can, again, divert where we need to divert and make those referrals, and then have appropriate responses by fire and police where appropriate.
Absolutely. And finally, you know, our existing partners that we think are doing a fantastic job, the sobering van, mobile crisis team, you know, we would really like to act as advocates for any, you know, any expansion of those programs that are feasible. They're very highly used. The sobering van does approximately 20,000 transports per year. Mobile crisis team is hugely busy, both with police primarily, but also with fire. So anyway, we can advocate for them. We would like to do so. And then finally, as I mentioned, more case management. We have seen the results. We've actually published a study in a peer-reviewed journal showing that case management for high utilizers at the fire department level decreases their reliance on 911, and so any increase in capacity there we think would be amply rewarded. And Chief, I'll let you finish.
Sure. So as we conclude, I mean, our goal is to, even for our firefighters, is we need to change the way we think about, you know, when we meet a person on the street, where they actually need to go. Traditionally, we've been focused on getting them to a hospital. That's not the future. As we see healthcare change, as we see the population change, we need to create different avenues to meet people where they sit and give them what they need to be successful, if our goal is to take them out of the 911 system and help them have a better life along the way. And you mentioned earlier to Deputy Chief Garth Green, is where are they seeing most of this? The reason why you, Councilmember Mosqueda, you saw all of these type of calls is because we were in the core of the city. You did your ride along at Station 10s. We're seeing most of this in the core of the city. It's happening all over the city, but we're seeing it in the core of the city. I mean, you hear sirens up and down these streets all day long. That's the population we're responding to all day long.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? Councilmember Mosqueda?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate the entire presentation. I like this last slide on gaps and shortfalls. Obviously, you're at the right committee with the right chair who's talking about taking these issues to full council for conversation around the budget. But I'm wondering what, if any, body exists at the city level with the mayor and her leadership team to talk on a weekly or daily basis about how you're integrating these ideas and acting in real time. I went to LA and had the chance to talk to both their county and city folks who are identifying similar gaps and shortfalls and have kind of a tactical team that meets, it sounds like, weekly to talk about where there's gaps and shortfalls. Is there a similar type of effort here in our city to identify where there's gaps and shortfalls and act in the moment? Obviously, we have a lot of work and priorities that we'd like to see reflected in the budget. And I'm wondering if there's action taking place right now to figure out how to connect these dots.
Acting in the moment, I would say no, but John has a steady connection with all of the partners that you see on the slide before this one. So he's in constant contact with all of our partners to try to solve problems on a daily basis.
So as we continue to have conversations about how we stably house folks and make sure that people have access to health services, mental health services, substance abuse services, and make sure that our community feels safe, I think this is an issue that I would very much like to talk about in the context of how we're getting individuals who are also living in the street, who are homeless, who are unhoused, stably housed, into the services they need. And because we don't have that core set of services yet with a robust case management system, I think you guys are filling that gap, obviously. So perhaps this is something we can continue to talk about both in this committee, the new select committee, and our housing committee.
Talking about it everywhere. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so I also want to thank you all for coming today and making the time in your busy schedules to give us this presentation. It's incredibly helpful for us to understand a little bit at a deeper level the work that that you all and the firefighters and police officers are doing every day to address this particular issue. And no question, y'all are on the front line of having to deal with the realities of all of our residents in the city of Seattle, but in particular with the complexities that come along with those who are currently unhoused. And so I really appreciate your all's effort to continue to fine-tune and prioritize and innovate, frankly, around how it is the police department and the fire department can work together in collaboration with each other and with other agencies, both in the city of Seattle and regionally, to really make a difference here and get folks connected to the help that they need as opposed to taking a strictly criminal justice approach, which I think is incredibly important for us to continue to do. So I know y'all are committed to that, and we're going to continue to have conversations about how we can take what we like from other models that other cities are doing to ensure that you all have the resources that you need to continue to serve our residents well. So I appreciate it. Thank you. All right, so we are going to move to the last agenda item on today's agenda. So if you are here to present on the last item, I'd invite you to join us at the table while Cody reads it into the record.
Agenda item 5, Seattle Police Department Overtime Overexpenditure Workgroup Report for briefing and discussion.
Thank you, Cody. Good morning. Is it still morning? I think it is. It's 11. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with introductions, and then I'll hand it over to you all for comment.
Greg Doss, Council Central staff, and I was also a member of the interdepartmental team that worked on this issue.
Ben Noble, City's Budget Director.
Brian Maxey, Chief Operating Officer, Seattle Police Department. Morning.
Good morning. All right. Greg, do you want to kick us off, or is Ben gonna get us going?
I think the department is. But.
Okay.
Yeah, no, happy to do. So thank you for this opportunity. In bringing the SLI response, I think we really see this as an opportunity for a continued conversation about police overtime and the work that SPD is doing to manage that overtime. Just as a little bit of context before I dive into the specifics, specific elements of the SLI and the highlights of our response. Did want to highlight that police overtime has been a subject of study and interest and review for several years now. In particular, the city auditor completed a formal audit in 2016 that had a number of recommendations. And actually, one of the requests in the current slide was to go back and review the status of those recommendations, which we'll do just briefly here. And there's more detail in both the slide and some of the appendices that were provided to you as well. More generally, too, I wanted to make just an overall comment in terms of providing some context for the way, at least from the executive side and the budget office side, we think about the budget for overtime at SPD and the way it's managed. And in particular, there is not, strictly speaking, a budget for overtime. So in terms of the way the funds are appropriated to SPD, they're generally appropriated either in a geographic context, so there are budget control levels for each of the precincts, and then also for some particular functions. Within each of those geographic elements or those functions, there is an allocation to overtime. So that as we build their budget in consultation with them, we take into account the fact that they're going to need some funds in order to address overtime. But as we, again, at the budget office, think about how well the overall expenditures on personnel and overall expenditures are managed, what's key to us is not whether the allocation for overtime is exactly met or not, but rather whether the department is able to manage its overall expenses within its budget. And the reality is that overtime has in the past been an issue that has driven them above those budgetary appropriations. So that has been problematic. And we have been back to council late in the year, not recently, well, depends what you count as recent, to ask for an additional appropriation for SPD. And that was a point of concern, understandably, for council and one of the issues that is raised in the SLI. And having said that, I also would note, in addition to having mentioned the auditor's findings in 2016, that in the 2017 budget, there was a very purposeful increase in the allocation for overtime at SPD, again, coming out of the recommendations of the auditor to better align the allocations with what were experienced realities on the ground. So in particular, there was an increase of $5.4 million. Some of that was internal transfer, about 3.4 of it, and then $2 million was an additional allocation, recognizing that the overall budget for SPD was not sufficient to cover their overall expenditures, including overtime. With that intro, I'll dive into the specifics that were requested in the audit. In the statement of legislative intent. One was to comprehensively describe SPD's overtime policies and practices and their relation to the 2016 audit. So actually, I want to turn to Brian to just describe a little bit about those. There have been a revised set of policies and practices, and he can describe that just at a high level. Again, there's more detail in the slide itself.
Yes. Primarily, the audit, some of the significant auditor's recommendations focused on the overtime policy and recommended that we improve that to tighten both controls and oversight over both the executive management over overtime and the supervisor level. We did that. We tightened it down. We made it very clear that any overtime approval needed to be done in advance of the overtime with a few exceptions. And if those exceptions were met, that it needed to be reviewed after. We also limited the total number of hours that officers could work within a given time period, which helped us get a better sense of the time that officers were spending. In terms of off-duty work in particular, we implemented a tracking system within Blue Team, which is one of our management systems, so that every request for off-duty work was now tracked, and we were able to compare it side by side to ensure that the total hours in the given time period were not being exceeded. So we met the auditor's recommendation vis-a-vis our policy, and I think we've seen some good tightening on some of the numbers as a result of that. The budgeting of overtime, as Director Noble indicated, they said that we needed a more realistic number. There was a bump in 2017 in the allocation by approximately $5 million. That did help. As noted in 2017, we were actually able not only to meet our overall budget, but to return about $3.5 million back into the general fund. Additionally, we continue to work diligently to get an electronic tracking system for all of our work. This is known as the WST, or Work Scheduling Timekeeping Project. I think we are in the final stages of the RFP, and we expect the new system to go online in Q1 of 2019. So it's actually a pretty rapid deployment of it once the configuration process starts. And that's all budgeted for, and we are moving forward with that.
Great.
If I take the slide request somewhat out of order, that was the first one was, again, this report on practices and policies. And again, I think we've documented those pretty well. And if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I think that's largely work that is, if it's not complete, it is moving forward in the way, in particular, the deployment of the new timekeeping system. A third question, the third item that was called out in the slide was an evaluation of best practices in overtime across the country. Just in the context of the slide response here, what we've largely done is to rely on the audit that identified that at the time, and again, we've only really seen improvements since then, that the practices that SPD in terms of management practices are comparable to those elsewhere in the country. And the auditor had done that work. So we didn't, just in terms of efficiency, didn't want to revisit all of that. So we're satisfied that SPD's general management approach is consistent with best practices. And again, what's important to me is that the overtime is seen as an expense that is needs to be managed throughout the department, and it is, and again, consistent with the policies that have been described, that supervisors are approving overtime and are conscious of the total expenditures of those. And again, those are the types of best practices that the auditor had seen elsewhere. The sort of moving backwards, if you will, the second question that was called out in the slide was to identify the root causes of the gap between budgeted and actual overtime. And that was actually one of the areas that where the work group spent a little more time and actually has led to some potential recommendations of follow-up, which going in, I'm not sure that we had anticipated. So if you have the slide response in front of you, on page 4, there's a graphical presentation that highlights what the mix of things that are driving overtime. And what I find interesting about this is that it's remarkably consistent over time. I mean, what we know is the total amount of overtime has increased in dollar terms and actually in hours as well. But it's not that we can identify one particular factor that has been the recent cause of those increases. It's rather seemingly an overall increase in the demand for police services. And as you can see, we've highlighted here that sort of broad categories. Regular duties, which typically I think, and Brian can add here, are things like emphasis patrols, where there's a desire near term for some additional deployment, and given the staffing levels that are available, the best way to do that in any kind of immediate moment is through overtime. The other really big one here is events, and I'll come back to that. Sports is called out. Depending on which sporting events, we have arrangements whereby the city is being reimbursed in part or in whole for those expenses. And then you can see some of the others. The events one is an area where we've ended up working with, as a work group, coming back with a recommendation that in some ways is a question back to the council as well. What we know is that is a significant share of the total overtime, and what we know as well is that the fee structure we have now does not fully recover costs in situations where it's appropriate to charge. To be clear, in free speech, and these categories are set out in policy. For free speech events in general, where charging isn't appropriate. But for things, the ones that I always think of, because I at least used to participate, fun runs, where street closures or bike races, where street closures are necessary, we do charge for the police and public safety costs that are associated, but we do not charge a rate that fully recovers our costs. And there are a variety of reasons for that. The most direct one is that it's expensive. It costs the officers, particularly officers on overtime, are an expensive resource to be deploying, and it can be difficult for the organizers of these events to cover those costs. But on the other hand, they're not necessarily generalized public benefit, and charging can seemingly be appropriate. So that's just an issue that the council has looked at in the past. We brought forward recommendations, and in fact, I forget the exact year, there was a change and an increase in the costs that we charge. But as it stands, we still are under recovering our costs in those areas. So if there's council interest, this is, in terms of recommendations, that was one of the ones we called out. It was something that we could dive back into and take a harder look and be able to perhaps summarize better what the gap now is between costs and recovery, and offer up ideas about what might be done to increase recovery. In the past, we've phased increases in recovery charges in order to help entities, the folks who organize these events, adjust their own business model to be able to adapt to those additional costs. So that's, again, poses a question to you. I'm not necessarily looking for an answer today, but as you enter the budget process, there might be opportunity to pick up that thread and provide some further direction on whether that is an area of interest. At staff level, there was a recognition that that's an area that in this overall sphere we have some opportunity to make headway, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had received a report from the city auditor's office on the conclusion of their special events work, which was, sort of a little bit of a web because it involves the Office of Film and Music as well, and then SPD. SPD is the one that is most, I think, directly impacted by those recommendations. So we have some follow-up work that we need to do in terms of the policy changes that need to occur to follow up on some of the recommendations that were made by the city auditor as it relates to recovery of otherwise what could be reimbursable costs to the city. And I'll be working with Greg and Cody to sort of think through some areas of opportunity there that I think would be a fair shake and a fair deal for taxpayers who are effectively subsidizing some of these major events that might otherwise be able to afford a little bit more in terms of paying the city back for public safety services. Councilmember Johnson.
Just a couple of brief questions. So $67 an hour is what we're charging folks right now, and that, as you articulate very well in the memo, does not totally cover in any way, shape, or form not only the staffing associated with it, but any other costs, vehicles, support staff, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. What's the average overtime rate for just an officer themselves? Are we at it? Is that about $67 an hour, or is it Brian saying a lot higher? Brian,
currently it's at $74 is the average for that. That will likely change should we get a new contract.
Right. So, if you're filling out one of those special event forms and you're doing a neighborhood fun run, on average, how many hours is included in something like that? Any estimates?
In what's included in the process, or what we
hours?
actually are able to put on the special event form to be reimbursed for? And the
Yeah.
reason I draw the distinction is we're not allowed to charge for planning or for anything other than the time the officer is actually on scene. So
Yeah.
that would be dependent on the length of the event.
I'm asking the question to try to get a sense to the chair's point. If there's a difference, I think, between a major event and a neighborhood fun run. And when you're doing a neighborhood fun run, what's an order of magnitude about the cost of that, and what would be the changes that might be impacted if we were to increase that hourly reimbursable from 67 to something north of it? And then secondarily, what would be that sort of average cost for some of the larger scale events, and what would be those cost deltas? That's what I'm trying to drive at. I don't expect to have the numbers off the top of your head, Brian, but as we get into those kind of questions potentially in the budget process, or as we ask the work group to do further analysis, I think it'd be helpful for us to get a better understanding that if you're trying to do a neighborhood fun run, and right now, and I'm pulling these numbers totally out of thin air, your costs to the city to close down that street and have SPD out there for that Saturday is $5,000, and we're going to increase that to $6,000. That might be a doable kind of a thing. But if it's $5,000 and it's actually going to increase to $12,000, then we need to be cognizant of what that impact would be, and weigh the benefits and costs of having a really fun event that might result in a lot of wonderful cultural appreciation and community building versus the loss of that if you can't afford it anymore because we've increased the costs. Ooh, that was, I think, a couple of seagulls.
Seagulls smacking the outside of the windows of City Hall. That's where they're trying to get in. I think on the flip side of that, I think there's some evidence that an increase in charges actually results in event planners modifying how they address and staff public safety issues, or things that they sort of broadly categorize as public safety, but might actually be crowd management or crowd control or direction, I guess is a better way to phrase that. And so there is some indication that some event planners have decided to beef up their event volunteer base to do a lot of that directional stuff instead of using police officers, which cost us overtime, and we can't get reimbursed for all of their time. So I think I think there is a sweet spot to be found between categorizing everything as public safety because there's an event versus, not providing any public safety services at all. I just think that it's important for us to evaluate this through the lens of making sure that we, as stewards of public dollars, are being transparent and accountable to our taxpayers who are currently subsidizing a significant portion of some of these events in terms of their public safety needs that could be addressed in a different, less expensive way to event planners if they choose to do so. But right now we have sort of a cookie cutter approach to how these things are done, and it is costing the taxpayers millions of dollars every year to continue to support the model that we currently have. And I think it's incumbent on us to explore other ways to do this that are fairer to taxpayers and to event planners who continue to do events in our city.
You know, I mean, for me, one of the ironies is that many of those fund runs are actually intended as fundraisers for the underlying sponsors.
Right.
And if we did the net math, we might start to wonder about, the effectiveness of those events. I recognize that they are much more than that, again, having been a participant among others. Just to echo more of what you were saying as well, I think opportunities to think about the location of events and in the context of a fund run, again, having picked that one, the route itself, and, are there ways to minimize cost? And if you're facing more of those costs, just simple incentives, pushes you to think harder about those things. But again, as consistent with the policy discussion about this, there is this very healthy tension or real tension between the importance of the cultural and community events that we're describing and these costs. And I think trying to find that sweet spot has been and continues to be an ongoing effort.
Well, it does appear, according to the memo that we've got, that it's been a good 3 years since we've revisited that. So I look forward to your ongoing work on this, Madam Chair, and can't wait to support you as we think about what that balancing act looks like.
So the last item that was in the slide that we wanted to cover was the number 4, if you will, recommendations about the approach to budgeting, and in particular, giving council opportunity for oversight and in my mind, awareness. So as I've described, we have added resources in 2017, net new resources, as well as reallocating some resources within SPD's budget. Candidly, they still spent over that amount on overtime. As the budget director, I have to admit I have some fear that if we give them more money, they will do that again. Because again, these people are managing to that overall appropriation. So that said, in 17, SPD brought in its overall budget, as Brian has described, about 1% under their overall allocation, which is just over $300 million. And it's still a little bit early in 2018, but we expect the same actually this year at this point. So I think the best thing I can offer at this stage, but open to more, is that we have and will continue to provide ongoing updates to council throughout the year on SPD's use of overtime relative to the allocation. Similarly, we can provide comparable information about their overall budget, because as I've described, just focusing on the overtime piece and not the overall budget only gives you a partial picture of what's going on. As we get the new financial systems up and running and their reporting functions fully implemented, there'll actually be an opportunity for staff to do that directly. But we do not want to be surprising you with a request in the fourth quarter supplemental that wasn't anticipated. And frankly, given how that the budget process moves through into late November, that's not realistic. We can't do that for you or for us. So I think we have those mechanisms in place. We've been providing regular updates on the use of overtime and the expenditures, and have every intent of continuing that going forward. This is again, so that we're being responsive and accountable to the public, but also to council most directly.
And I think it's important for us as we have this conversation and continue to have the conversation around this, and this is this is a drum I've been beating on since I became chair of this committee 2.5 years ago, is, I think it is a practice amongst law enforcement agencies to have overtime budgets. And it is true that most law enforcement agencies, particularly the ones that we typically compare ourselves to on the West Coast, do tend to have an overtime budget gap. And so I think the question for us, and the thing that we continue to struggle with, is how do we make sure that the gap that we have in terms of our overtime budget is smaller rather than growing, and I think that has been the struggle for us as a city in terms of how we budget and allocate and appropriate, and how we project what we will realistically need in the budget in terms of the realities of the work that needs to be done. And one of the things that I found really interesting in the slide response is the perhaps counterintuitive conclusion that actually hiring more officers, most people think that if you hire more officers, that will result in less need of overtime. But actually what we have seen is that the more officers we've hired has actually resulted in more overtime usage. So maybe, Brian, you want to talk a little bit about that, because that seems counterintuitive to me as a layperson, and I'm sure that there are folks who might find it equally counterintuitive.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is that there will be a sweet spot. Once we have enough officers, once our staffing is at appropriate levels for the city of Seattle, then the offset on overtime will be decreased. But it's going to take us a while to get there. Even as we've been upstaffing, with the amount of work that our officers are doing is also increasing. The special events are going up. The city is growing. This is actually increasing the number of special events. We actually, between unpermitted and permitted events, we're counting about 1,000 in 2017 that we took care of, and we're on track to do the same this year. One other aspect that I would really highlight is the training that we're doing. You know, we just heard about it in the last presentation around the crisis response, but in the critical areas of use of force, crisis, de-escalation, and bias, we've done 250,000 hours of training since 2015. And that's not just in developing the training that would be overtime that the training unit would expend, but it's actually backfilling for officers that we pull off the streets. So as we double the annual training from 30 some odd hours up into as many as 80 for basic levels and as many as 150 for specialized units, those are hours that we have to backfill on overtime. We don't train on overtime, but we do backfill on it. So as we increase our staff to a level that would be appropriate for a city of 700,000 people, and we're not there yet, I think once we get the numbers high enough, then the overtime will be used more as an efficiency to offset anomalies or special needs of the city. Right now, we're using overtime to not only accommodate those special needs, but also resolve our gap in staffing. So that's why there's not a natural one-to-one relationship there, but we'll get there.
Got it.
Another element, or another way of describing some of that, is that we've been adding officers in response to increased demand for services, but it takes a little while to add those officers. So we're trailing, and the demand for services hasn't plateaued yet. So we're trailing ever more, if you will. And again, in the short term, overtime is the resource that's available to meet that increased demand. But again, as we add more officers, and there's some hope of plateauing that, then I think there's some. I certainly have the hope that over time it will at least again plateau itself and not continue to increase.
Yeah.
Sure. Just a brief correction, because I heard you say, Brian, that we weren't over 700,000 yet. If I remember right, we're at like 725,000 residents.
I said a city of approximately 700,000.
All right, just making sure. We're growing a lot, and to your point, Director Noble, I think continuing to emphasize the ways that we can make sure that we are more efficient with our resources is a good thing, but that doesn't negate the need for us to continue to grow the officer force to respond to not only the influx of new residents, but certainly as our economy continues to grow, the influx of new people coming to the city every day for employment is also a factor I think that we need to be cognizant of. And I know you hear about this a lot as the chair of this committee about the need, particularly for the fire department as well, to respond to the influx of folks that are coming into the city every day for work and the responsiveness that that requires of our municipal services as well. So we're going in a lot of different ways, and we need more resources to do a lot of different
and I think it's an important nuance to recognize that there are over 700,000 people who live in the city of Seattle, but we at sort of the peak of an employment day, like today, we're probably closer to 1 million in terms of the people who are currently within the city of Seattle, and that doesn't include our tourists who come through or passerbys that come through. So obviously, if they're here, something happens, the police department has to respond, right? So we have to acknowledge the fact that we have a very significantly larger population than we've had in the past, and I think the policy question before us is sort of how do we continue to recruit and hire and improve our own the things that we can control within the hiring and recruitment processes to be able to do that faster and more efficiently, and I think that's going to be helpful in terms of not relying so heavily on overtime as the Band-Aid to not having enough officers on the force currently.
Question.
Councilmember Mosqueda.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a question about the city attorney's new announcement of enforcing free speech I would say enforcing penalties against those who are expressing their right to protest and participate in free speech. Given the interest in prosecuting more of those protesters, have you done an analysis of whether or not that's going to require more police time or overtime, impact the overtime estimates from our own police force?
I certainly have not. I mean, I do think, though, that, and I do not want to be seen as taking a position on this one way or the other. I think of the example that has, I think, triggered this. I mean, it's a recognition that disrupting traffic causes its own costs. So there's a balance there as well. And again,
It sounds like you're taking a position.
No, I'm only pointing out that that if we're talking about costs, we need to think about costs on all sides. That's all. And I don't think that cost was the driver in the city attorney's decision in any case.
Well, so the answer to my question was no, an analysis has not been done on how much staff time this could potentially add for the police department or on overtime costs. Is that accurate?
No, there's, to my knowledge, there's been no such analysis done, although, off the cuff, I wouldn't anticipate there would be any increase. This is not like a drive to arrest more people. I can't speak for the city attorney, but my understanding was that he was not shying away from holding those we did arrest accountable rather than encouraging more arrests. But again, no such analysis has been done to my knowledge.
Okay, great. I'll follow up with you guys. Thank you.
One of the recommendations that came out of the city auditor's report, particularly around special events which include free speech events, was better documentation of the amount of time that officers were spending in responding to or managing those free speech events. Is that one of the things that has been done? And if so, can you just talk a little bit about how that's being accomplished in terms of record keeping, et cetera?
So it's happening in two places. One is at the Special Events Committee, which SPD is always a participant at designing what the city's public safety needs are going to be. There is that's just not SPD at the table. That's all of the city partners looking at this and finding the right balance. And I think our participation in that has helped us also in the ones that we staff and plan for with IAPs individually to make sure that if we get through intelligence that a certain number of people are going to show up, and then we deploy officers to that event, and then it turns out that's not the number that have shown up, we're much better at pulling back those resources, reallocating them, and not leaving them out there than we have been in the past. So we are tracking it. SPOC, our the Seattle Police Operations Center, has gotten far more sophisticated at tracking that. This is one of the things that was a requirement and criteria as we developed the WST program RFP for us, is that we would be able to track that and better allocate it in real time. That's the important part. It's not after the fact. It's while it's occurring, what are we doing with those staff? And we've gotten a lot better at that.
Okay, great. Anything else from you all? Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Really appreciate all of the work on the IDT to further dig into the details related to some of these overtime concerns and practices. And we will be following up with you all on the special events aspects of this to see if we can create some greater efficiencies there. And just look forward to the continuing reporting, and we'll continue to have you come back to committee to give us updates on the work that the department is doing to both implement the city auditor's recommendations and also just to continue to find those efficiencies and best practices as it relates to overtime and a lot of other issues. So thanks so much for being with us. If there are no other questions or comments, that is the final item on the agenda. So we are adjourned.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Thank you.